And welcome to Beyond the Dollar Signs with your host, Mark Taylan. Mark, how are you? How are things out on the West Coast as we record this?
Good morning, Bill. It's great to see you. It's sunny. You can feel the season change already.
Oh, that's so nice. Back here in the Northeast, where we have hints occasionally of spring and sort of the promises in the air. But boy, I tell you something. It hasn't quite made it yet. We still get some frost tonight. So you're talking about something that's interesting today, which I find intriguing. It's something you call the sandwich generation. So what is that? Explain what you're going to be talking about today.
Interesting, right? So, they talk about all these different Generation X, the baby boomers, Generation Z and Y, and I lost track, right? But there's a generation, what we call it's been termed for quite some time now. It's called the sandwich generation. And that is typically people between the age of 40 and 60 that are caught right in the middle of taking care of their parents and their children.
Oh, yeah. Been there, have been there. And it sounds like a lot of people are there right now, as a matter of fact.
Yes, and I'm starting to see that. I've actually seen that for quite a number of years now. It's normal for, adult children at some point to step in for their parents, as they get older for financial, healthcare reasons. It's, those type of things. But now we're seeing that caught in the middle aspect of where they're also taking care of their, they've got their own children, and maybe those children are in college or transitioning in life. And so they're caught right in the middle and sandwiched in between the two. There's something also called the club sandwich generation. I'm not sure if you've heard that term.
No, I haven't, as a matter of fact.
I just heard that term recently, by the way. And that is when you are caught in the middle, but not only taking care of your children, but the grandchildren as well, right? So you're starting to see, the times are tough. The economy it's not easy. So a lot of adult children are potentially moving back home, and they're bringing their own families, and they've got their children. So imagine being caught in the middle of your parents and your adult children and your grandchildren.
Man, oh man. I honestly, Mark, I can't. And I imagine that there are some incredible, I don't imagine, I can just sit here talking to you, think of all of the challenges that the sandwich and especially the club sandwich generation have to face.
Yeah, definitely. There are challenges, and it's something as a financial advisor. And when we're doing these plans, it's one of the things that, we often don't think about, right? And we don't often think about because if you're on the later end of that 40 to 60, if you're in that 60 to 65, most people are living longer. Right. So your parents are probably 85, maybe, 80 to 90 even, or above that. And so, you're taking care of them. And then, you're not thinking about, and they typically have assets, right? And so, usually that's not a financial burden, but it could be, right? So you sometimes do bear the burden of the financial part of it, but also you do step in and have to do planning for them, because oftentimes if your parents haven't had that conversation with you about assets, or they don't have a trust in place, you need to step in and assess their situation. So it's another, it's another planning thing, right? Tool where, if you think about you're covering their cost of care, what's their cost of care? What are their assets? Can they afford that? And so you're making those decisions on their behalf, right?
Yeah. So look, in addition to the financial strain, which you were hinting at here, I go immediately also to sort of the emotional and psychological strain, because I don't care how much you love people. You can love your parents, your children, grandchildren, if the case may be, to the moon and back. But it doesn't mean that situation doesn't create some emotional and psychological stress as well.
I'm sure that absolutely does, right? It's sometimes very heartbreaking to see your parents' health faltering mentally, right? If they have some cognitive issues, you're seeing that. So and a lot of times families, it's great sometimes when you've got multiple siblings to help in that, help in taking care of parents, because then there's that rotation. But that's not always the case for some people. Some clients I have are only children, right? So it's them and maybe a spouse that bears that, if you want to call it a burden, right? Let's call it responsibility. Right?
Let's go with that word. Yeah.
I like responsibility better than burden, but the responsibility to take care of their parents, and it does create a very difficult a dynamic, I guess, because it takes an emotional toll, a physical toll, if you are having to go and see them every day and talk to them, because a lot of times as parents get older, they get disorientated, right? And frustration, and it becomes it's like that role reversal. The parents taking care of you, and now you're taking care of them, right? So it's definitely very, very taxing.
I would correct me if I'm wrong here, but because I have seen this in other people, I get the feeling that people who are caught in this situation will also probably sacrifice their own well-being and their own self-care, if you will. That's what the word I was looking for, because they get so caught up with everybody else's troubles. Do you see that? Is that a real thing?
That is definitely a real thing, right? And usually what I've seen it when a husband-wife dynamic, and imagine you're a husband and wife and you're older, and let's say your wife's health is faltering, you have to take care of her, and it comes to the point where it starts affecting your own health and mental well-being. So I definitely see how that that has an impact for the children the same way, right? It just has a huge impact. If you think about the flip side too, on the other side of the sandwich, right, is the adult children. That's very difficult because, if we talk about the adult children, it's hard when your adult children move back home, right? I think about this all the time for myself, right? Once I have 3 children, and once they leave the house, and if they need to come back for a short period of time, you've got different boundaries in communication, right? They've left the nest, but now they're back home, and so there's different expectations. So it's a difficult place to be, and then so you have to have really good communication for boundaries and finances, and if there's grandchildren involved, it really does even changes dynamic even more, because now the grandparents, where they're used to being, hey, let's, we can't wait to see the grandkids and play with them. Now they're living in the home every day. So, that does create other layers of issues.
So what do you recommend for people who find themselves in this situation, Mark? What do you tell your clients, and how do you advise them?
It's really tough if you're caught in the middle and it's impacting finances, which I see that it often does. It's, we need to probably sit down with your financial advisor and think about, if you're retired already and you're on essentially a fixed income, and now you've got a family, you've got your children's family living with you.
Right.
Your expenses have went up exponentially, probably. If you've had the responsibility of also taking care of your parents, your expenses I think there was a statistic, 59% of families pay for the cost of long-term care. So you could see the stress that it can create financially. That's number one, right? And so at what point will it impact your own financial plan, right? At what point will, you have to sit with your advisor and look at, my expenses went from $8,000 a month to $14,000 a month, and then they're out of control, right? And we can't sustain that. So it's really important to sit with your advisor and review that and how it's going to impact you. I think at some point there's only so much that you can help your children, right? To where it does impact you.
Yeah, man. I just to talk personally for a minute, if I had known how much long-term care cost when I was a lot younger.
Mm-hmm.
I might have been persuaded to think seriously about buying a long care policy back then, when it would have been a whole lot cheaper to do. And is that one of the things that you talk with people about? Because that's a big, big issue as people get older.
That's a great question. And actually, that's something we definitely plan for. We call it stress testing. So every financial plan we run for a client, we usually use the 80 as a number that they're going to have a long-term care event, right? And we anticipate that happening because the probability is high. I mean, in Northern California, it's anywhere from $8,000 to, I've heard, $20,000 a month on the really high end.
Wow.
Right? And so imagine $100,000 a year for a period of, 4 to 5 years. You're going through money very quickly. And so it could really, change life circumstances, right? If you blow through all that money. So long-term care policies, of course, the traditional ones where you pay monthly premiums. Mm-hmm. Certainly the younger you are, like anything else, because your health is typically a lot better. Yep. You're going to get a policy and it's going to be more cost-effective on a monthly basis. However, what we've seen is as more people are retiring and needing them, those premiums are rising. And when you're on a fixed income, you typically can't afford a premium that doubles. And so inevitably what I see happen is clients need to make a decision where they need to cut somewhere else to be able to afford that premium, or they end up reducing that policy, value. Yeah. So they have less coverage. But there are other options for people later in life to have some type of long-term care coverage. It's called in the industry asset-based long-term care, where you take a lump sum of money and based on your age and health, that money can be multiplied a certain number based on when that time is. So as an example, 60-year-old, 100K put in a policy, that could be worth up to $300,000 to $400,000 for the cost of long-term care. So there are solutions, and it's certainly best to talk to your advisor and stress test that, because the probability is really high.
Yeah. And then before we wrap this episode up, I really want to hear what you talk about in terms of, or the discussions you have in terms of setting boundaries, because look, a lot of people probably went through this for a really short-term period when maybe their kids moved back in briefly with their kids, so that, there were probably a lot of temporary club sandwiches out there, to use the lingo, but it's like, and I think that they didn't have, because it was a short-term deal, maybe the tensions didn't build to the point where it led to stress. But how do you talk about setting boundaries? Because that's really difficult. It's one thing for you and I, who, are grown people and we're not family, we know one another professionally, we can set boundaries, right? Sure. It's a little more difficult when you're having to do that with your kids and your parents and, people who you may be really inclined to not think about boundaries with.
It's such a difficult concept to think about, right? It's difficult discussion, but it has to be had, especially with parents to their adult children and their families, right? Because the lines get crossed. And I think that's the most important thing, is communication and boundaries, making time, if you're the parents, making time for yourselves too, right? Because now your household dynamic has really changed. And so I think it's super important to discuss those boundaries, and also to think about and have that discussion about planning. Like, what is the next step, right? They're adults, but they're in your household. What is the next step long term? How long do you think they will be there, and what's their plan? Or are they going to be there inevitably for the long term, right? Is that their new way of life? And so I think it's an opportunity for you to sit down and think, how can I help them? What does it look like? And is this going to be 2 years, 3 years? Is it a short period of time? And if that's the case, what are the things that the parents can do to help them, get to the next step? Maybe it's a job loss. oftentimes it's a divorce situation as well, right? If it's a divorce situation, oh my gosh, I feel so bad because the cost of that whole process and attorney's fees and the stress, typically the spouse that, it's a lot of money. And that typically I've seen come out of the pocket of the parents, right? Because they have no choice really. And if there's custody issues, Bill, it's like, wow, the money's going out the door. What's the plan? What's the next step? So the boundaries and the communication about what does it look like in the future? And probably I would imagine their children in their minds, their headspace, they don't know at that point. They're just trying to survive. But at some point when things settle, I think they really need to sit down and think about what's the plan going forward here, and have that kind of communication.
Yeah, it sounds like open communication sounds like the best policy. Mark, for people who are listening to this podcast and are, who are not clients of yours and might be interested in having at least an initial conversation with you about some of this, what is the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Best way is to look at, in the notes below, we'll have a Calendly link to schedule time on my calendar. I do 20-minute Zoom meetings, right? Just to have these kind of conversations with people, and hopefully I can give them enough advice to help them. And if that leads to, more, additional meetings, we're definitely absolutely open to that.
That's fantastic. So check the show notes. The other thing that you can do, folks, is if you're not a subscriber already, maybe you just came across this podcast, subscribe, hit the follow button. It's really simple to do. And then when Mark puts out a new episode of his podcast, you can listen to it and give it a listen to see what you learn or what it might mean to you. And if it means good things to you, I would ask you that you rate the podcast, give it a good rating, tell people about it. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Dollar Signs, Financial Clarity. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit our website at www.advisors360pwm.com or give us a call at 408-778-8280. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Advisors 360. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.